Joel Heath is an artist and musician. You can find him on Twitter and Instagram through the links in the description. Joel is always looking for commissions and has worked on podcast, band, and restaurant branding. Joel, what's the point in art? Why do art?
Oh, geez. You go with the heavy, starting off with the heavy hitters. That's a difficult question. Because it changes all the time, and it's like a permeating system. Can't speak today. I would say, like, a certain amount of enlightenment can be attributed to it, like to elicit a response. The first thing that came to my mind when you said that question was, I thought of a lot of the Orthodox and medieval iconography of like the kind of Middle Ages, pre-papacy split, where a lot of artists are working for the churches and stuff. And the whole point of a lot of their compositions were these, like, they were basically just cosmological illustrations of, like, multi-dimensional realms. Like, you would have, archangels, saints, and then like peasants or like, noblemen and stuff. But then you have, like, in the periphery, like demons and like, Satan and other things. And, you have at the top, like Mother of God and all these other things. And so the compositions of those were designed to appear in such a way that people could view them, and it would elicit, a response, and like that they could, and there could be like a learning element to it as well, which is kind of the more illustrative quality of it, is that they're like, if you place the composite of like the Mother of God at the top, at the zenith, you're suddenly allowing for the eye to basically show that the importance of hierarchy in that, and in through composition. So like, that's like the first response I would give, is like, it traditionally has always been a means of communication, but it's like, it's where kind of like words can fail and formal language. That's why, like, when I said, like, I'm not a very formal person, it's difficult sometimes to like encapsulate, what is the meaning of art and how it does change. Andrei Tarkovsky in Sculpting in Time talks about how film is like a very new medium, and like new mediums arise as civilization changes. So I think it's difficult to define the meaning of art, but I think art also evolves alongside its civilization. And you have artists that come about in their time and their place that in kind of like a mirror way reflect back the culture, whether it's through subversion or parables, and like, that's just so very narrow. That's a very like narrow description of the point of art, because there can be like art of, there can be like art in the tradition of like pagan indulgences of like, transcendent partying, or like, which I would see like with like electronic music, has a lot in common with like pagan practices and stuff. And I'm saying that not from a condescending standpoint. Mm-hmm. So it's difficult. I mean, we also live in a world of multiplicity now, where kind of in the postmodern narrative, it's very difficult to kind of pinpoint something. But I guess for me, like, art has always been something that it comes about of its time, but it also is timeless. Like, there are filmmakers that you can view their work, and you can see like their circumstances. Tarkovsky, maybe could be one that comes to mind, of like, the Soviet Union. But at the same time, you can view his work outside of that context, and those themes in that work can still apply to different civilizations and different time periods. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it's sort of it was the hydra of questions that sort of raised about 5 or 6 others.
It's a hydra question, so, for sure. I can cut off one head and I could go for like 3 hours. Like,
it's a good way to start a conversation, though, in my opinion.
Yeah. I like getting the curveball thrown at me that then striates into like 50 other heads.
Yeah. So I thought the religious connection was really interesting there, because I think the status of art aesthetics and sort of our meaning and interpretation of it runs very parallel to this idea of revealed truth, right?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Completely converse to anything analytical you might want to say, which is why, you know, they're almost, the definition of art is that there isn't a definition of art, right?
Kind of, yeah. That's like that. It's that paradox of it, though. That's how it exists. It's like there is no definition, but there is a definition implied within that.
Right.
You know,
right.
It's almost in a lot of ways like faith. In a lot of ways, is that you don't really get an empirical reason to believe in something, but you want to. You know, like there's a certain amount of like initiation or invitation to participate in something, but it doesn't also have an empirical meaning to it at the same time, or like empirical definition, I guess.
Yeah, and this is why, you know, analytical analysis completely fails when it comes to art or religion, and this is why we end up with, you know, some pretty awful like atheistic arguments, which are, you know, talking about the age of the earth, or whether there was or wasn't a flood, or, you know, it doesn't even correspond. It's not even in the same logical realm almost. And it makes you sound, it's annoying because it does make you sound a bit stupid when you're like, well, you know, if you can't define something, you clearly don't understand it, or something like that, right? It's
well, yeah, and we live in an age where like rational reasoning is in the West, at least. I would say this is primarily Western post-Enlightenment thinking has a cult of rational reason, you know, and so that everything has a sort of scientific approach to it versus you know, the symbolic realm, which is, you kind of really can't define the symbolic realm. You can elicit the symbolic realm from like language and say, oh, this symbolizes this, or this kind of has a meaning to it and stuff. In a lot of ways, you can't empirically, physically define the symbolic language. You know, that kind of occupies a realm that is inherently mystic, religious, artistic. You know, those branches are, you know, but those can lead to like, you know, yeah, I think the imagination can lead, you know, like a scientist to discovering something. So it's kind of, we forget that the seed of like something can begin in kind of a very abstract, you know, immaterial realm. You know, if you know, like with faith is like God is the material, immaterial at the same time. It's beyond our conception. So it's like, that's kind of similar with art in a lot of ways. You know, it's kind of it's like it's kind of beyond our conception at times, but it's deeply important regardless.
Yeah. And this is again where I think analytics sort of fails, because if you think about a circle, right? And in analytics, a circle is sort of that perfect round shape, right?
Yeah.
Which for something that's, you know, the supposed to be the empirical minded way of looking at things, doesn't actually exist in reality, right? And then you look at something symbolic, like, I don't know, like there's so many circles, right? You can look at mandala or Ouroboros, all this sort of stuff, right? That's a symbolic circle. And, you know, analytically minded, you look at a mandala and you're like, well, no, it's not a circle at all. But the way we perceive it is that way. And, you know, it's funny how this supposedly empirical or, you know, rationally minded way of looking at things doesn't actually correspond to reality. I would say the symbolic way of looking at things, the way we abstract and pick out things which are important to us as humans, and then sort of mentally ignore or reject the things that we don't see as useful, is actually I mean, I think I'm closer to the sort of the school of what's it called, existentialism, where
Same.
Like experience is actually the most real thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. There's a great interview with Alexander Dugin. It's like a documentary on him where he describes.
This is where the liberals go quiet.
Yeah, no, this is the part where they go, all right. I just don't even care anymore. Like I just like there's like he described it really resonated with me, and it kind of goes with what you're saying, where he describes if you have a ailing illness or a injury to your body, and sometimes it's better to approach that not from a medical standpoint, which is, I'm not discounting the importance of that, but sometimes you should approach it from like the symbolic realm of like what is causing the ailment to the body, and like what is the kind of because sometimes the thing that causes a very, real circumstance, like, an illness or something going wrong with the body, even if it's like, a joint is out of alignment and is suddenly causing distress on the other side of the body, and so focusing in on where all the attention would be of like, oh, I have pain right here, but you're negating that maybe it's on the other side of the body, and that there was something symbolic actually came from that, like maybe someone's behavior, or like, someone's depressed, they're like hunching over, they're leaning more on one side, it's causing more damage there, but in the body's response, it doesn't actually focus on that area. It moves to the opposite area in this very kind of irrational way to almost detract your attention away from it. So what I'm getting at with that is, and what Dugin was saying was, it's like we should look at the symbolic meaning of why something is falling apart. Why is there damage to something, as opposed to the cult of utility or rational approach sometimes, because sometimes those really fail us. Like I think of Mikhail Bulgakov's novel, The Master and Margarita, where you have all of these kind of atheist, materialist intellectuals in Moscow, living in kind of decadence, but they can understand like what's becoming of them, that like Satan is actually doing some damage to them and stuff, because he's kind of angry that they've become materialists, because they suddenly are not, paying attention to him. So he's actually very weirdly like doing the Lord's work in a very like indirect way. So I think it's hard to just kind of, and I live in a very like, I live in the Bay Area, which is a very tech oriented, utilitarian kind of cultural environment. And so I think sometimes we should look at things from a more irrational and symbolic realm, is what I'm trying to say. If that's kind of a roundabout way of putting it. Yeah.
And the hypocrisy kind of enters the zeitgeist as well, because a lot of sort of I don't know, I would say like in my country, like Shoreditch crowd, but also Bay Area people they also have this sort of natural inclination towards like analog things, right? Like people love the Polaroid pictures or things that don't serve that utilitarian purpose. Like, they'll have a stack of like action figures in the corner of their bedroom or something like this. And those don't actually serve a utilitarian purpose, despite the profession of utilitarian beliefs, right?
Yeah, and utilitarian beliefs aesthetically are kind of evolving us to a more immaterial realm in a lot of ways. And I think a lot of people fetishize that idea of progress, but at the same time, there's a lot of mourning of the physical realm and the analog realm. And I think you kind of see these kind of irrational desires of, what is impractical coming out, where people, collect things and physical things, and they want to own analog things, or like, the kind of Mark Fisher kind of hauntology of like, Polaroids, where like, it's kind of transporting you to an older time. And I think that's kind of people's longing for the sacred in a lot of ways. I really do feel like a lot of that is kind of the sacred is always veiled. It's never like out in the open. You know, you can look at, you know, theologians who've said that. You can also look at George Bataille, who's said that. Kierkegaard, a lot of these like people, you know, the sacred is inherently veiled. So therefore you can't actually put your finger on it. So in a lot of ways, that's its very nature is concealment in a lot of ways. And so I think people, they want to return to these states through kind of a vessel, and a vessel could be, you know, an analog thing, because I mean, in a lot of ways that is still, you're desiring just mass consumerism from just another era. There's a certain, you know, like inherently like irrational quality to it, but it's more of the poesis that it's bringing about.
Yeah. What I find strange about that phenomenon though is that you have, you know, various revivals, and, you know, people say quite often that, you know, the culture's gotten quite stale because it's just rehashing things from the past. We see things like, you know, 90s aesthetics and 80s aesthetics coming back now. You know, Stranger Things is very popular. People like to profess things about being a 90s kid, even though they were born in 98 or whatever, right? And it's strange because lots of that stuff, you know, the main audience of shows like Stranger Things weren't actually around in the era they're nostalgia for.
Exactly.
For example, I'll relate to something that, you know, that I do sometimes. I went for lunch today to a very old pie and mash shop, one of the last ones in kind of the neighborhood around here. And when you go in there, you know, everything's kind of shitty, right? Like, obviously it's English food, so you have to put so much salt on it to trick your brain into thinking you're actually enjoying yourself. I don't know what radio station they play, but it just sounds like it's from like 40 years ago or whatever. And like everything's faded, the decor, it looks like you're in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And I kind of like it in the same way I'm a big fan of big band swing music.
Okay, cool.
I have this weird feeling of nostalgia for a time that I never experienced.
Yeah, that's kind of like I feel like the 2010s is really defined a lot aesthetically by a longing for a different period of time. You know, there's I think he's a UK musician, The Caretaker. I don't know if you're familiar at all.
Oh my God, yeah.
Exactly. You know what I mean? And I think that's the whole conception of his project, is like the feeling of being unable to regain something that you never actually experienced, you know? And like, I'm old enough now, I'm 31, where like, I see like the early 2000s when I was like a teenager being like revisited and rehashed, like horror movies and stuff from that. And it's strange because it's like, you know, you see like blockbuster liminal space aesthetics, like, you know, like just like music from that time and like all that. And it's a lot of that even still is rehashing from the 80s, because the 80s is kind of where you really see mass popular culture really taking on this kind of accelerated quality, where things are just reproduced at a much quicker rate, and like it's easier to consume stuff. And I think people's longing, honestly, for that is the sacred. I think it's it's some sort of like desire to like revisit something, because it's escapism ultimately. I mean, that's what a lot of, you know, popular culture is inherently, is like it's escapism. And so it's fleeing from the fears of a present. But it's like, like I remember like in the early 2000s, like I still would remember like very uncomfortable periods of time where I would like, you know, be watching movies from older times and be wanting to be then. So it's kind of, I think it's an escape from the present in a lot of ways. And I think once something, there's a beauty to it for sure. Like on the West Coast, like there's a lot of older kind of like 60s and 70s homes that I really like a lot. And they're kind of utilitarian looking, like a lot of right angles, very Richard Neutra looking. And they're all built on like hills, and like some of them, like, you know, they've been neglected because it's typical like West Coast. There's like some like, you know, Teva sandals, old couple with like, you know, white dreadlocks living in them. And, you know, there's like moss growing on them, and like tons of pine needles collecting up on like the deck. And like there is something beautiful about nature reclaiming something. And I think you can kind of see that that essence in, you know, Stranger Things, or these like resuscitated like aesthetics that are still trying to like look like they're from a different period, like they look decayed, like you can't put your finger on when they were created and stuff. Because I don't know, I sometimes wonder if it's like an existential fear of technology, like that people do kind of think they've like let something out of the box that they can't contain now. Like I think there is like a fear around like technology now, and I think maybe that's where a bit of the longing for different periods of time kind of maybe comes from, like our like disassociation from nature, or like that perhaps like more analog tools were less alien to us, you know, like that we still used our bodies with them, as opposed to they become more and more detached from physical labor. I don't know, does that, if that makes any sense or not, but I see. Go ahead.
There's really like an economic connection there as well, because you mentioned the 80s, right? And that really
Yeah.
ties into sort of Reaganomics,
Oh yeah,
over
big time.
here, Thatcherism, and sort of the debt. Like obviously debt was a thing before and a big thing before, but like a real explosion of the fact that it's not about production anymore. It was more about debt, right?
Exactly.
And you know, that's when you see, you know, capital was already picking up, but that's when you really see this runaway capital. And we seem to have already correlated the fact that that's when this sort of rehashing and sort of desperate sort of clinging to the past as much as you possibly can, as someone who's stuck on this ride you can't get off, sort of happened and started becoming a thing.
Right. And that's the kind of when you start to hear a lot of the globalist kind of rhetoric coming from like politicians around that time, which, you know, is not a right or left scenario. That's more of just a Western, you know, Pax Americana, Pax Romana kind of thing, where you see like the expansionist kind of quality of the West happening. And I think that the difficulty with that is I think we do also see the dismantling of culture by that, because, you know, the thing that's kind of that I was thinking about before we came on, because I kind of felt like we would touch upon some of these topics, is like, you know, you go to other towns, like at least in the States, you know, the States feel like, you know, just different countries. And like in California, like it's kind of sad, because growing up there was a lot of like the mining towns from the gold rush era, like up in the Sierras. And I've seen those kind of slowly become more and more gentrified. And, you know, you just see kind of like the 5 same brand buildings in every town now, and they kind of lose this kind of regional flavor to them and like identity. And I think that's kind of the 80s is like, I think, yeah, you see that runaway capital kind of happening. And that's when this kind of the chains start kind of billowing out. I don't really have quite the vocabulary to describe that to the same degree, but I think that's kind of where you start seeing the decades of repetition happening, where there's kind of longing for different periods of time. And like, it's different than like a period piece or something where it's trying to like depict like an event or something. This is more like trying to relive something, like resuscitate something, live within its kind of a cadaverish kind of aesthetic to it. You know, I think that's why you saw like online in the 2010s, you know, that's when I was like in my 20s. You saw the liminal space aesthetic, or like vaporwave, or like all this stuff that was kind of this like deadened quality to it. And it's just mass consumerism. Like it'd be like, you know, like an image of like a indoor pool at like a Hyatt, or like a, you know, like, or like just a random chain motel. But there's like a certain essence to it that I think people are like drawn to, and a longing, you know. But really, if you look at it, it's objectively not like beautiful. I mean, it's not like, you know, looking at a painting by like, I don't know, Lucian Freud or something, you know, where there's humanity. It's like almost devoid of humanity, but it's like there's a longing for it at the same time.
Yeah, it does kind of make the mind think about what kind of awaits us in the future as well. And I mean, like, you know, depending on your outlook, either wonders or horrors, right? I can imagine in maybe 40 years time, you know, it being kind of, you know, kooky to buy a smartphone and do TikTok videos, or there'd be some sort of imitation of that. And there'd be some sort of new, I don't know, mind meld technology that everyone's using. And, you know, it's kind of kitschy to do a TikTok video or something like that.
Yeah, it is kind of seems Nick Land is pretty right on his observations. Yeah, I mean, I think aesthetically, the sadness of that is that I think we're going to lose. I think you lose. I mean, Rene Guénon talked about this with the reign of quantity, and that we're in a quantitative cycle. And like, I don't really subscribe to like the cosmological view of, you know, Kali Yuga cycles and stuff. I'm more of like a literal narrative kind of person, Judeo-Christian kind of style, you know, beginning and end. And so I think, you know, we are arriving closer to a more immaterial realm where like you don't really like, you know, film auteurs like David Lynch has already kind of announced as kind of like a dead thing. We're kind of losing certain concentrated like works for the sake of quantity. You know, I think of like NFTs now as like the kind of the hybrid of like digital currency and like art, where like you're paying for a JPEG. And it is fascinating in a battalion sense to let people just like drop thousands, millions of dollars on, you know, like basically a screenshot of JPEG quality image. But it's more of like a reflection of the absurdity that the art world was already arriving to, but just like to an accelerated degree in a lot of ways. Is this like I mean, it's fast food in a lot of ways. It's just snacks. It's so quick. There's just quick carbohydrates. It doesn't last. And I think that's kind of I think that's what we're getting towards, is like, instead of something that is like where art was more of contemplating, you know, it was more to elicit contemplative thought. We're kind of in the complete opposite of that. It's novelty and immediate gratification.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that from like a cynical standpoint. I'm not trying to sound like a judge or like a trad. Like, I have more like traditionalist views for sure, but I'm not trying to be like, it's just, it's where things are evolving, you know, that something is moving through the human consciousness that people are either apathetic towards trying to stop it, or are just engendering its progress.
Yeah. I think with the sort of traditional art world and the inflation we've seen there, and what we see going on with NFTs, and, you know, like you say, like someone sends some Ethereum and it's like, oh, this is like thousands and thousands of dollars, theoretically. I suspect that, like the traditional art world, there's a lot of dirt moving through that monetary system.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Because someone's just like, oh, I just sold an NFT. I don't know who bought it, right? Something like that. Because I don't buy it, you know. I don't buy that, you know, these JPEGs are actually being bought for that much. I don't buy it.
Yeah, I wonder sometimes if it's like an artificial economy, you know, like I grew up in the Bay Area, and like I remember 2008, like when the economy crashed, and the first place that gentrified overnight was the Bay Area, and there was a lot of money being pumped into Silicon Valley at that time. And like you had like the mayor at the time, Ed Lee, who was like inviting and eliciting tax cuts to large tech companies to come up. And I'm not talking shit on tech, it's just an observation of perhaps what might be going on, is like the tech companies coming up, and basically that's when you kind of start to see the 2010s, in my opinion. That's when you start to see the 2010s like neoliberal, like kind of blanched aesthetic starting to take hold. And it was almost artificially engendered, and I think to reinstate the American economy, because like before that, Silicon Valley was kind of like a niche thing culturally in the Bay Area, especially. Like it's like, oh yeah, they're like down there, but it's like, you know, for the most part, San Francisco, Oakland, like Berkeley, those were kind of just like these like hippie train wrecks, you know. Like they're just like kind of these like dirty places people just like came to party in, and there were shows, and like there was some economy and stuff, but it's like you really started to see this like beginning around that 2008 2009, like just the prices going through the roof for like the worst apartments in San Francisco. And then it slowly trickled to, New York. And it followed a lot of, just like Gen X 90s, like artistic and music scenes, the Mission School in San Francisco, Brooklyn, of course, don't need to be said about that. Then East Los Angeles and other cities. So it's kind of, I sometimes wonder if the NFT thing, like what you're saying, what there's money being pushed through it, like that maybe there's some other incentive going on with that to kind of get people to buy more. And so it's like being artificially pushed forward for that active engagement.
Right. But this is, again, it's like dirty in lots of different ways, because it could be like I said, it could be like between I'm going to say, lack of a better word, like cartel, but it could just be me myself, and I put out some NFTs and sort of pay myself for them, right? And say, oh, someone just paid for this, right?
Right.
But then on top of that, right, someone could be, an NFT artist and, buy like 9 out of 15 of their own works for so and so much, giving the impression that the rest of them are worth a certain amount as well.
Yeah. There's a certain grift to it in marketing.
Yeah. And as someone who's been in crypto for a long time and has kind of left and come back over waves of, there's the ICO wave when everyone had their own coin offering, and now there's the NFT wave. Every time one of these like waves happens, I leave for like a few years and come back when all those people have left and people are talking about the technology and its potential again. Because I feel like it's, it's completely lost on so many people, unfortunately,
Right. What was I going to say with that in regards to that? I mean, did you have any other questions? Actually, I know we've been kind of just.
Not loads. I mean, the Art Y one is the first one, and we've ended up here.
Let's bring it back to that right wing, that nice right wing structure.
Yeah, exactly. No, I thought it's been a good riff so far. But yeah, I know I would like to talk about your art a little bit.
Sure.
Again, I think it's testament to how kind of informal you are, but it was kind of interesting to go through some of your socials and try and work out what is your art and what is to be completely honest with you. That's not an insult at all. I admire that as someone who's able to do that. But I mean, we've mentioned Japan already, so that's like clearly like a big influence on at least some of the more recent stuff. And I can see like kind of, there's the obvious like kind of anime influences, but there's sort of these, the print textures as well. That's in kind of like traditional Japanese art, which is, kind of like an early kind of minimalist aesthetic with these kind of like it's prints and it's bold lines and it's all these sorts of things. And then, obviously there's a modern aspect to some of your art because, I one very recent piece I saw, which is like, it's like strange esoteric winged humanoid standing next to a Gundam. And I'm just like, I wish I had the imagination of the guy who drew this.
Yeah.
Or whatever he's taking. I don't know what,
Right. Yeah. I mean, I actually had to like kind of make a little list just because it's I can go on these rants and there can be a little. I know artists are like notorious for not being able to explain anything they do. I mean, if I can give like the best description, I mean, I would say, I was born in 1990, so I can still kind of remember the 90s, like in the early 2000s, especially like anime was being imported into American televisions for the first time, I believe, around then. So you had like an influx of shows like Neon Genesis, Evangelion, Sailor Moon, kind of also some just like really ultra violent, hypersexualized stuff that was like kind of not quite to like the same caliber. Like it was a much more intense caliber than some of the stuff on American cartoons. So I think, I was like definitely like a kid who drew anime characters, like definitely weebo nerdy kid, but like at the same time, my mom is like a painter and my dad's an architect. So I grew up with a lot of their influence around of, my dad, drew Bond, as an architect. And so there was a lot of like the drafting tables around the materials, books on art. So I think, at the same time, while I do have an interest in like pop culture from other countries, like there's still a pretty good anchoring to art history. Especially when I was a teenager, I got really into the post-impressionists and subsequent German expressionists. Those kind of the line between those is kind of gets blurry, you know. So, and that's when you had, though, a lot of Japanese prints being exported from Japan to Europe. So you had like the exposés, where, you know, Munch, Schiele, Klimt, a lot of these very popular artists who also experimented with, you know, mass production. You know, they experimented with printmaking, kind of the first form of mechanical reproduction of art. And I think that's when you start to see that influence, because in the West, you know, we were more inheriting the Renaissance's influence, pre-Raphaelites, where you have Cartesian perspective, you have, you know, there is this rich tradition that happened in Florence that kind of was still pervading. And then I think, you know, with industrialization and a certain amount of globalization, where, you know, you have art from the East coming, and then plus the wars, which I think would influence especially the German expressionists, but the post-impressionists, like you do have that kind of emphasis on flatness that starts to happen, where you start to see the material being used against the replication of life and more for stylistic maneuvers and more for, like a more flat view. So I think, you know, that really influenced me for a long time. And the artist I studied under in my early 20s at school, Jerome, who was a figurative artist in his own right, but had a sort of modernist approach at the same time. Like he was definitely someone who, you know, could render a figure in a similar ability as Raphael, you know, just sheer skill. But at the same time, he liked, what's his name? Whenever I'm on the spot, I can never remember artists' names. Oh man, he painted these like flat kind of comic looking characters. I'll remember him later. But he had like a respect for, you know, outsider art, for more broken, flat, less academic looking work. And, you know, now like academic art is pretty much thrown out the window, and we don't really have the figure as much anymore in art, except for in NFTs now. But like, I would say with like my work, it's kind of, you know, there's an imaginative quality to it. I've always been into religious art from like the medieval ages. And I would say, you know, the Renaissance and medieval art has a lot of similarity to anime, to manga. Like it has like a certain amount of the cosmological mapping within a two-dimensional space. So like, and I'd say it's almost like Japan almost has that more than the West, even though it didn't really originate in the West because they had the yokai and other kind of things. So I think that's kind of the realm that I'm always interested in, is kind of the symbolic realm. And kind of, I mean, it's hard to not be influenced by postmodernism now, because it's around us. So the relativizing of aesthetics can be a very impulse. impulse. But in that, at the same time, you can get stuck in kind of a lot of cliches and popular aesthetics at the time. So it's like, I think a lot of the stuff that you probably saw on my Instagram is kind of me, you know, all that's drawn by hand. But then in the digitizing process, you know, of converting something to a digital medium, as everything becomes a digital medium now, I would start to play with the filters and kind of try to make it look older. And so that's kind of going back to your Stranger Things comment, you know, where it's the longing for something to appear older. So, you know, I would use these, like, it's weird. I would like be on Photoshop for hours, like just like adjusting the levels and the filters to try to make it look like older paper, you know, and like to have that kind of same quality. Cause like, if you just like scan a drawing into, onto a computer, it's going to pick up all this stuff that just like doesn't look good. Like it's going to pick up like, you know, smudges, like finger oils. It's going to like dilute the paper tone, and it's going to like make the lines harsher. So in a lot of ways, you're trying, like in Photoshop, I'm trying to actually just recreate the natural state that a drawing exists in. with my own eyes.
Yeah.
You know, so that's kind of like, I think where a lot of that influence comes from. I impulsively take stuff down because I've just gone through so many phases in my life as like an artist, and I've been like posting art since, I don't know, like I like on Tumblr or like other blogs since like the early 2010s, and then I like, you know, move on from that, and it's like a sudden identity change, and you know, I'll take that down. So yeah, it's kind of, I think I'm always trying to ride that line of, you know, the flatness of stylistic mechanical reproduction that kind of happened in the post-impressionist era with, you know, lithography, printmaking and stuff, while at the same time trying to create something that has a sort of essence ontologically that functions outside of just being a novelty of like a replicable medium. You know, like I think of like the German expressionist artist Katie Kolowitz is a really good example. She had two sons. She had a son and a grandson that died in World War I and World War II, and she made these very grief-stricken prints about, you know, the horrors of war. You know, her, you know, it'd be like a mother like weeping over a son's carcass, and it really intense imagery. But she used, you know, like these mass production mediums to kind of convey that. And so, you know, it can be replicated. Some prints are higher quality than others. So yeah, I think that's kind of, I'm always, highbrow and lowbrow culture kind of come together a lot for me. You know, like I think I get the same experience, you know, watching an anime that would appeal to like a, you know, 18-year-old guy as, you know, I do viewing Van Gogh or, you know, other painters. You know, like I kind of try to like avoid the kind of cultural, like there's kind of like cultural signifiers sometimes of like of art scenes and stuff, and it's like that's like an important thing for me to try to avoid at times, is like if you're into anime, you become this like weebo nerd guy or something. And like, or if you're like into like highbrow art, you become like, or like older art, you become like a trad, like guy who hates progress or something. That's just from my experience of observation. It's trying to just like, and I think the postmodern spirit is sometimes allowing multiplicity to exist in that way, that these things can kind of, there are truths in these, and that they can exist side by side. So it's like, if I draw like a kind of medieval inspired line drawing with like a sort of weird Gundam looking creature in it, you know, that's maybe more representing the devil to me than a Gundam. But it's like, you know, in a lot of ways, like maybe our perception of what, you know, the great tempter can be, you know, like the great tempter could be something that is no longer like a, you know, hybrid reptilian red human, but maybe it's something that appears more mechanical and less human, you know. So if you'd like to answer another question, I can go on. I'm trying to like keep a lid on just the ranting.
Right. Well, I guess on the topic of the Great Tempter, what is a collection of Gundam toys but little idols, right?
Exactly. I mean, it's not much different than a, you know, a pagan totemic figure, you know, in a lot of ways. And I don't say those disparagingly, because like I have like a I have this like weird carved wooden bowl that's like, I think it looks like it's like from like the indigenous peoples from like Alaska or Washington or something. It's like kind of got that totemic look to it, and it's like I love that stuff. And like I think we as humans like are a part of like what we are is we create worlds. We create these kind of microcosms, simulacras of the world and how we view them. And like, you know, that's kind of the playful beauty of art, and especially working in figurative work where you're creating an atmosphere, you're creating an environment. And it's like social media is kind of just an extension of that. So it's like I kind of, when you can't tell what is the art or what's not, it's kind of, that's kind of the world it is now. It's the drawings exist there, but it's in this, you're viewing them through a kind of metaphysical lens, you know. Their ontology in a lot of ways has kind of been like, I may not be using that word correctly, but I'm pretty sure like their ontology has kind of been like be constructed in that way. Like you're not viewing it in person, so you're viewing it from this other lens. So that's like kind of me. I'm just like always trying to create like I just feel a deep sense of like curiosity and passion towards the world. And like when I create stuff, I spend hours isolated doing it. And I just, want to instill that same sense of wonder, in others.
Yeah. It's sort of when it comes to, art's clearly something you find meaningful. And, when you're spending that time alone, focusing on this thing, you enter a flow state as much as someone who's finds writing meaningful, or someone who's devoted their life to a religious order and, prays for the same amount of hours alone that you would spend creative. I kind of see them as analogous, really.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's very similar. I would say a lot of art is spiritual. I'd say, and entering into those. That's a newer term, the flow state, but I think it's also just kind of giving away the senses, giving away to the act of creating is. I think that's kind of I think that's maybe where I'm like, having my more religious leanings on my sleeve is that I think that's one of those moments where you have a metaphorical experience of creation and appreciating all that is around us at times,
Yeah. And the senses are in a way quite analytical, because, if you're doing something that you're not particularly meaningful, you're disastrously aware of the time. And when you're doing something that's meaningful, you completely lose yourself in the fact that you're not, analyzing how much time has passed.
Right. I mean, it's funny you say that, because like, I've had a fair amount of success in my life as like an artist and a musician. And I've had moments where I thought like my career was made, and then, I would have another 5 years of kind of pretty nothing, like I'd get like a huge commission. I'd be like, oh man, this is it. Like I'm breaking through. And then it's like, no, and then it just kind of goes back down. And I think about that, like time, like the sacrifice of time is something that like, is not a huge consideration. I mean, there was like one time I lived in New York City in my early 20s. And like the first summer I moved there, like I'm not very good at reaching out to my friends. So I think my friends forgot I lived there. And so I was like living in this apartment and this is like 10 years ago now. So it's still like kind of a sketchy area of like East New York, outer Brooklyn. And I was like drawing. Like I had like a part-time job because this job paid well enough where I could only work like 3 or 4 days a week and make my rent. And I remember I was just like in this apartment for like 3 or 4 months, like it was super hot, just like drawing and like working on my old band's album and stuff. And I was just like, I kind of look back on that time, I was like, wow, like you just like just sacrificing like periods of time in your life just to do something that like you can't really define its empirical value. It's like, and there's like a lot of and it has a religious element. Like there's like stigma sometimes. It's like, what are you doing with your life? Like you're choosing to do this very impractical thing. Instead of building certain life skills, like getting into a relationship, or getting into a company and like investing time with them or something. There's a certain amount of either disillusionment or just iron will that I think comes through.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yeah, like you said, there's probably some hardships that go through just making rent, or being in an uncomfortable situation. But in the same way that you ignore time, you ignore the discomfort, right?
For sure. I mean, it's back and forth. I mean, as I get older, it definitely starts to rear its head more, with like just health issues, that you don't have when you're 20, I think it almost gets, I think a lot of artists lose steam by their late 20s. And I think if you can make it through that period and into your 30s, I think that's kind of I think that's a very pinnacle moment, I think, when people have a very big like life shift. Yeah, I mean, dude, like there have been times where I was like, I should do something else. But the thing is like the whole journey of like choosing to do something has been incredible in itself. Like I've worked some of the strangest jobs in my life to make rent, and just like met and had like the most bizarre experiences in my life. And I think in part because of just being, an ambitious artist, and like just, I think in a lot of ways that kind of invigorates life. And I think that's maybe just going off the theme of like vitality. I think it kind of gives this fountain of youth vitality to it at the same time. It's kind of like you shake hands with like a certain life. It gives you one life affirming life force, but at the same time, it guarantees a certain level of extreme discomfort, which you could say is religious in a lot of ways at the same time.
Yeah. On the topic of weird jobs, I did do a bit of stalking, and you mentioned that you worked in an art storage warehouse that was holding like the collections of, I think it was Jim Carrey, and who else was it?
Yep, Jim Carrey, Oprah Winfrey's
Right.
personal collection. Yeah, I think it was called Neverland. That was Oprah Winfrey's room, and it was like in this dilapidated warehouse that have you ever seen Repo Man?
No, sorry.
Okay, that film really encapsulates the aesthetic of that job. It's like this like East LA like smog-ridden area, and the guy who ran the warehouse was like kind of like a Canadian art mug, or like a mafia guy. Like he's kind of like the guy like art institutions would like go to like he's like the cheap guy to go to. And like
how ridiculous are we talking? Are we talking like bad suit and a cigar, or like what?
No, he just like a Quebecois, like a lumberman, like he like would roll up his sleeves. Like he's a respectable
art dealing lumberjack, a respectable art dealing.
Yeah, like if he offed me in the desert in Joshua Tree, I wouldn't be that ashamed to like. But basically, this place was crazy. I mean, it was like full of a lot of like musicians from like the 80s. So you had like a lot of people who would be like, oh yeah, I remember Guns N' Roses. Or like you'd get like punk guys and stuff. It was cool, but like, yeah, so they the Jim Carrey one was funny because like they had to go get his art, and I guess he like lost his mind one night and painted his whole house white, including his like TV and his furniture. And they're like, yeah, he's kind of insane. And like his art's not very good in my opinion. Like it's pretty bad. It's a cult of personality kind of thing. And Oprah is like, I think hers is like, it's like kind of funny. It's this very like humbling thing when you realize like a lot of people who collect art, it's just like basically just investments, which I totally get. Like, if something appreciates in value over time, you want money to like have a value that's not affected by inflation. So like, Oprah's like art collection sits in like a dirty office space that's like in the corner of in like a huge warehouse with like cockroaches. Mm-hmm. It's like you peel back the curtains and the layers, and you kind of start to see, how the system's operating and stuff. And it can like definitely the grandeurs can be kind of dismantled that way. So yeah, I used to work there. I used to sleep sometimes on my lunch break in the warehouse, and I almost like died once there. I got like hit in the head with like a metal piping system, and that was like kind of intense. Yeah, it was a wild. I got fired from that job actually too. Which is rare to get fired from that job. You have to really screw up.
Yeah, the odd warehouse with the cockroaches in it. I mean, I dread to think what you did. I mean, do you care to Tell us what you did.
Well, I think I kind of just like humiliated the boss's wife by accident, where like I took some, like I found this like marble stool thing in the corner of a warehouse, and I was like, okay, this is what they want. And like this like collector out in like Connecticut or something, who hadn't like reached out to like the company in like maybe 10 or 11 years, was like, hey, do you still have this thing on file? And I found it in the corner. It's like covered in dust and like crap and stuff. And so I took a photo of it as is, you know, and sent it to the boss's daughter, who was the registrar. And she sent it to those photos to them, and they flipped out. They're like, what? This looks like shit. And it's like, so she got yelled at for that. And I think that's why I got fired.
Right. Well, I think fired for honesty is pretty good then.
Yeah, it's not bad. And I mean, you know, I think it's not like a long, it's like a kind of job you don't want to do long term. There can kind of be like the, oh, this is great, you know, it's like I have like a new crazy story every other week and stuff, and like everyone else is like doing like kind of a weird person or something. So there's like kind of a self-reinforcing like feedback loop of like, oh yeah, like this is the right way. But so it's probably good I got fired. That's what I'm saying.
Right. So we've spoken a bit about kind of how, you know, what the Western Enlightenment's kind of like the spirit of reason, and how sort of our postmodern state, it's kind of the spirit of relativism. And I don't know, because you I think I picked up on a lot of kind of relativistic leanings in some of the ways you've described art and its sort of merit. I don't know if you'd call yourself like an out and out like complete relativist, but I do think that, you know, the relativist like state zeitgeist we're in, sort of calls out for, in the same way we've talked about, you know, the utilitarian gap and that sort of thing, calls out for this spiritual thing, calls out for, and it manifests itself in psychologically very different ways. Like I think you've mentioned the sort of, you know, the sort of trad revival or whatever, right? Like it's right. You know,
it's a total lacra.
And it's all about identity, right? It's all about like, oh, I'm this thing or I'm that thing, and you know, you can be, you know, a trad person, anonymous person on Twitter, or you know, you can even be a weeaboo, which you've, you know, mentioned that you admitted that you are a little bit of, or were a little bit of as a teenager.
Yeah,
the West has a very odd obsession with Japan, and like specifically anime, and well, I guess the whole culture really. And I guess, I mean, I think Japan's pretty cool, right? You know, it's got its own merits as a country. I wouldn't call myself a weeb or anything, but I mean, as someone is kind of on the inside, maybe you could give us some insight into what you think psychologically this admiration comes from, or whether you know, is, you want to just say, oh, it is just an aesthetic thing. I don't know.
I think it's psychological for sure. I mean, I think I'm not a total relativist. Like I definitely subscribe to a specific narrative that I'm gonna answer that question, that statement real quick, and then I'll move into the Japan thing. I think the interesting thing with relativism is like, I just read an essay by Saint Basil where he recommends the importance of reading pagan literature to all Christians. And I thought that was very fascinating because it's actually like a very relativist approach. Where a guy is actually saying like, you know, these are very important and like, and you know, you should read them, you know, contrary to like maybe what a lot of people would think with like evangelical culture or some sects of culture of Catholicism, is like where it's, you know, shuns like any sort of, you know, culture that might be might have like derogatory content or something. So it's like you do see this importance in plurality, and that truth can be, I think I personally believe that truth has a core and a zenith, that truth is consolidated in a specific area, but that you can find truth also across a spectrum. So there is a relativist point where it's leading you closer to it. So to answer that, and then with Japan,
can I just ask a question on your answer there?
Yeah,
because I just thought what you said was really interesting, because you know, that's one of the eternal sort of philosophical or logical questions, is the like the nature of truth, the status of truth, right? And I thought what you said about, you know, there being a zenith, but also truth, or like, because we think of truth as like right or wrong, right? And it's an attribute that things have. Like this is
It's a dialectic. Sure.
it either has the Boolean value yes or Boolean value no. This is either true or false, right? But what you said is very interesting in talking about it, because when you said like it's a zenith, but it's also distributed. It's almost talking about it as if it's a substance or something like that, right?
Yeah, not in the Spinoza's way, but like
Right.
I'm a faith-based person. So like for me, my opinion is going to be pointing to that. But I think you can also find kernels of truth that lead to that. Because like I wasn't for a very long time. So it's like I think there's kind of I don't think, I mean, from a faith-based person's perspective, like truth isn't really a dialectic, you know, like it is objective. And that there is objective truth in viewing pop culture just as much as reading esoteric philosophy, that there is grains of truth that can elicit a response and bring oneself closer to something, you know, like I see my own trajectory for years where I'd get like something would resonate, but then something else I would find would also resonate a little bit more. And it's kind of growing in this kind of, and maybe that's also just my belief in the linear structure of things, that like I don't really believe in reincarnation or a yogic cycle of things like that evil is a substance, that good is a substance, that like things are in flux and stuff. That I think actually do things that things are moving in a pretty empirically linear direction. And so I think if things are moving in a linear direction, that must mean truth has in some capacity a destination.
Right.
Does that answer the question?
I think
my opinion is biased. You know, it's inherently biased because of being a faith-based person.
Faith. I don't know. My favorite statement about faith is that faith is opinion, and I'm not saying that in like a derogatory way. It is it is opinion, right? And I mean, I guess what you're kind of leaning into there is maybe seeing truth as a dialectic. I wouldn't like attribute like you as a Hegelian or anything like that, but it sounds like you're saying it's more of a dialectic, right?
I don't know if I'm in a Hegelian sense. I can't really get down with Hegel too much. I'd say the guys I connect the most with are like Bataille or like Kierkegaard, Plato. I don't know. I mean, I think sometimes when truth is regulated to a dialectic scenario, that can still create a multiplicity of truth at the same time, because it's inviting opinion and stuff, versus like I think faith is kind of a leap in a lot of ways towards truth. And so that you're going to suddenly start subscribing a lot of your previous opinions to that, because to have faith in something believes that there's already a model established. And so you're going to mold certain amounts of your life that may not be always comfortable to that model. And so I think, I don't know, I think trust can't always be a dialectic in that regard, like trusting something that like, I mean, I guess I'm painting it like a dialectic though at the same time, where
you could, I mean, logically speaking, you could arrive at the certainty of faith through a dialectic, but it's kind of like the difference between a bit of a loose connection, kind of like the difference between deontological and consequential ethics, right? Like just empty dialectic. I really like when you said inviting opinion, because like we've said, faith is opinion, dialectic is inviting opinion. You know, if you're constantly inviting opinion, you end up in a consequential place, which is just, you know, a constant dialectic of ever revealing or concealing truth, right? But at some point you could leap into the sort of deontological, like, you know, you're finally putting your pin in something, right? And saying, no, this is where we're stopping, or this is where I stand.
Yeah, and that like metaphysical, you know, like for me, it's like I was into a lot of like occult stuff for a long time. and I would find truths that I'd found in that. And like truths, I'm not saying the occult is true, but what I'm saying is like there are, things about like metaphysical experiences, astral planes, and then actually seeing in Orthodox theology validating that. Oh yeah, astral planes, that's the Ariel toll house realm. And that's what people think they're like contacting or something in these transcendent experiences, seances or whatever. So it's like, when I see that there is like truth from these two opposite perspectives validating one another, that means there's something concrete that these two opposing sections are finding that are, because sometimes with dialectics is you can get into this kind of new agey headspace of almost like Gnostic or Platonist stuff where you're kind of like flesh bad, spirit good, good, like Jungian good and evil, shadow and like ego. Like there's like, you're getting into these things where it's like the dialectic is more just this like balance versus actually kind of ascetic faith of moving forward through something, and that you don't totally understand it but gain enlightenment of it over time.
Yeah. And
so
sorry,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, like even the most like dogmatically, no, it's not about balance, it's about, the light or the truth or something. Even those sort of religious and like metaphysical views have this implicit journey through the darkness to return to the truth, return to the Father, return to the light, right?
Exactly. And it validates, in Mikhail Bulgakov's Master and Margarita, it validates, why shadow exists. The devil makes a very compelling monologue at the end with, I think, St. Paul, where he's like, you mistake my importance, where it's like, I give shadow to light, I give you form to like, so those that are kind of, that see that move towards you in a lot of ways. And I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to paint Azazel or Lucifer as good by any means. What I'm saying is it's like, there's kernels of truth in like darkness and stuff. And that like that, the narrative structure, I think the linear narrative structure, I think, allows itself to exist on this plane because there is light and shadow. There is a dialectic, but its ultimate arrival is not validating one or the other. It's that there is an ultimate truth. I guess it's just light. I don't know. That's just kind of, maybe it's just, I'm really a basic bitch about that, where I just say, you're light, Do you want to keep going on that, or you want me to answer maybe my opinion of the West's obsession with Japan?
No, I thought that was a really good sort of way of explaining it. I hadn't thought about it that way before, because it's almost as if, if you're asserting something, whether that's good or bad, it implies the opposite, right? And yeah, it's kind of like a cliche thing to say, right? But like the light logically cannot exist without there being the polar opposite, right?
Exactly. And it's kind of like the you can see that politically playing out, where it's like, you get extreme online right-wing stuff responding to the kind of obnoxious extreme left-wing kind of viewpoints, but in a lot of ways there's kernels of truth in both sides of that, and like that they're not divided. Like that's just the difficulty of dialectics, I think, is sliding into, I think, because we seek identity often through dialectics, there's like a sliding into one region over the other too much, because it can create an identity. And an identity in this world is basically a cartoon, which is that there's a black line, an outline of someone, but it's two-dimensional in a lot of ways. Like identity is a very flat thing to be obsessed with.
Speaking of identity, let's talk about Japan and anime.
Sure.
I watched Steins Gate. I really like Steins Gate. I thought Steins Gate was great. I love Akira.
Yeah,
Akira's a couple other things, and I don't think I get it. Please explain it to me.
Right. I think there's always going to be exoticism. I think that will always be a thing. I think the thing with Japan that you have is Japan is the most Western Asian country. I think they, when they were industrializing, I think, they wanted a seat at the table with the West and to kind of be the Western equivalent for Asia. So I think you had a lot.
So sorry to interrupt, but when you say the most Western, do you mean economics? Do you mean philosophy? Do you mean what?
I mean, they're extremely capitalistic for one. I think they were the first country to really pull a lot of influence. I mean, there was like the 10-year, Japan industrialized in 10 years. And I think the West, it took several hundred years because they were laying the foundations of it. And when that was going on, Japan was, sending ambassadors to go study how warships were made and how cities were constructed. And I think Japan has an amazing way of taking Western influence. Because, you can look at Akira and like a lot of anime as just being, influenced by European aesthetics, but it's like they make it very Japanese at the same time. And I think for one, not only is the work ethic incredible, so I think they have a sort of right-wing approach to artistic achievement that I really respect a lot of do at all costs to create something. And I think there is an imposing of will upon works. This is a very difficult subject because I have a lot of opinions, but I also feel not inclined to comment on this because I'm not a Japanese person. But like, I feel like, have you seen Neon Genesis Evangelion?
No, sorry.
I feel like that's a good one to watch in dovetailing with watching Akira, because I think you do see Japan's consciousness shift, because Akira was made in the 80s and you have a little bit more humanism in Akira. You have like people protesting against the government. You have gangs, you have culture forming in these kind of dystopian cities. Versus after the sarin gas attacks and that happened on the subway in Tokyo, I think that might have been like in the early 90s.
Is it Ocean Riku? Is that the cult? I can't remember what it is. Is it Ocean Riku?
I think so. I can't remember the religious cult that did it. They were basically an end times religion.
Yeah. Now that is a part of Japan that does interest me.
Well, yeah. I think dude, I got interested in Christianity again after watching a bunch of anime that was like Christian.
Yeah.
It's like they're not Christians though. Like they're Shinto. Like Shinto has been there for as long as I can remember. Like I think the Catholics tried to like convert at some point. I think that's what I think it was Martin Scorsetti's film about.
But China and South Korea have the same phenomenon with Christianity, right? Where it's kind of like takes on Christianity with Chinese characteristics or Christianity with South Korean characteristics. And this is so clear. And Shinto is unique in a way because it's probably the world's only like nationalist religion. Like you can't be a Shintoist if you're not like ethnically Japanese. If you're not living in Japan, you can't be like a Shintoist. As much as the weeaboos might like to try, right? But even Buddhism, which came over to Japan, is like it's Buddhism with Shinto characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain. I think it's the term is animism, where spirits are applied to many different objects.
Yeah,
and you have. I mean, there's more. I mean, the Shinto shrines apparently are like. There's so many of them, they're like kiosks, basically. Mm-hmm. They're like everywhere. So I think you do have like, and like, this is going back to our topic of relativism and grains of truth. I think you still have a very spiritual, superstitious society there. Even if it does seem materialist, I think there's an underlying fundamental versus like, you get more of the flat animatism in the West because I think it's post-Christian in a lot of ways, and I think I think spiritual like theology or pagan religions are starting to reinsert themselves in the West, but I think for a long time you had a very dominant hegemony of materialism.
Yeah.
And I think that's when you start to lose kind of the fantastical, the narrative, and the kind of things kind of cave over to more of a rational intellect, as opposed to, you know, something that's maybe cringe, where you're gonna like, I'm gonna create something that is like this like bonkers postmodern psychedelic religious mech thing that's just basically about a boy going through puberty. You know, like these very like they're like over the top like ideas, you know, and like machine fetishism and all this stuff. Like you get this kind of it feels almost like a sort of animating religious energy moving through it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of I mean, Japan they're kind of right wing, just like on a larger scale. I mean, like if you immigrate there, like I've had multiple friends who've immigrated there, like, or not immigrate, just like moved there and like secured a visa and stuff. And like they're second class citizens straight up.
Healthy gaijin, man.
Yeah. Like they like, and they kind of, but the funny thing is like the overall thing I noticed is like, they kind of respect the Japanese for it. They're kind of like, yeah, like, you know, I'm not allowed into this bathhouse because it's Japanese only. No. And it's like, you kind of start to respect it because you see how amazingly well run their country is. You know, just that it's incredibly clean. It's beautiful. The symmetry and the kind of synthesis of the artificial world of civilization and the natural world really collide in a very beautiful way. Like it's like they took a lot of models of Europe, you know, like the way the train systems work through Europe, and they like perfected it. And I think I can't speak for contemporary anime. I don't really watch a lot. Again, like I'm not like a weebo guy. I think it's just it or anymore. I think it's just like the influence is just there, and I allow it to exist because it's a part of my history and my creative trajectory, I guess. But it's like the older anime, I mean, it's so beautiful. And like they're looking at, you know, Renaissance painters for compositional inspiration, like digging through, you know, the Apocrypha and pulling from there's just so much there that gets in the good stuff that just gets compacted into this like, and I think our opinion also is like, highbrow culture is very different there because it's like in the West, you know, like we, especially from like being a musician for a long time, like, you know, avant-garde art music with like that's more conceptual kind of gets a very prestigious, you know, like place in terms of respect in Western society. You know, like it gets, you have like sound installations in like a, you know, a large institution and stuff and grants, versus in Japan, like comics are like are considered highbrow. Like this is to my knowledge, you know, from what I've discussed with some friends who are a lot more ingrained with the culture. It's like, you know, comics and like anime is considered like highbrow.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I think that's also just a part of like our Western conception, not being able to like wrap our mind around it sometimes. And I think you just see this kind of very beautiful back and forth of influence between artists. I mean, I know Katsuhiro Otomo, who created Akira, one of his favorite artists is Bruegel, and he did a recreation of the Tower of Babel. So I think you see this homage and this respect for Western tradition, European tradition, you know, because America comes from a European tradition in that sense.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Kind of like aesthetically speaking, this is, again, we're getting away from analytics here because you know, you look at you know, Michelangelo or something like that, and the reason why that's highbrow is pretty obvious.
Oh yeah.
And you open up a graphic novel and you know, certain graphic novels, or you look at Akira and it's obvious why this is highbrow. It's obvious why this is sophisticated. It's arresting.
Oh yeah.
And it's like yeah, it's a comic book. It's like, well, what are tapestries, ancient tapestries, but comic books?
Exactly. It's just, and what is, I mean, a film is basically just a comic put to a hyper degree in a lot of ways. It's
Yeah.
a movie, it's a way to animate a flat image in a lot of ways. It's a Frankenstein kind of concept of giving something life in a lot of ways. And yeah, I mean, it's just this is something I think that is kind of lost a lot in the West right now. And maybe this is really pretentious of me to say. But I think the kind of arresting that you talk about, where you look at something and it's pretty damn obvious why it's really good. You know, and I think that's the part where we get past dialectics and past theory, is where something just exists transcendently on its own.
Yeah.
And I think that's the part where, you know, we cobble together human abilities, resources to, you know, create something. And I think it, you know, words are kind of lost at some point where, like, it's pretty damn obvious why something's good, you know? And like a person who is well educated or not can kind of see that. And I think that's this part where it dismantles a lot of systems of thought in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I think even the most like Nietzschean last manish sort of person, which is quite common in the West today, you know, they see these sorts of pieces of art, or they listen to a piece of classical music, and I think maybe it's as a result of the West having a guilt culture, but there's like almost a shame response when people say like, oh, that's not my kind of art, or that's not my kind of music, oh, I know nothing about literature, I know nothing about music, or whatever. It's like that's like a shame response.
Yeah, I mean, well, like a lot of the West is, especially Anglo culture, is really based on guilt and shame, you know. And I think that's the unfortunate negative side of the. I don't think it's the actual reality of like a Christian society, but I think it spawned from that in a lot of ways. The kind of extreme guilt, extreme negativity, and I think that can kind of elicit and you see it taken to these really toxic degrees right now of shame and stuff. I mean, I think people are kind of like almost scared to take something seriously. I mean, I think sometimes like irony poisoning, cynicism, these are all kind of symptoms of I've got to hop off in about 5 minutes, just a heads up.
Okay, cool.
Sorry, I just, it's so easy to lose track of time. If you want to pick back up again, I'd be totally fine.
I was gonna wrap up. I was kind of keeping an eye on the time. Sure. I would really like to have another discussion, because
yes, let's please.
I didn't even get like halfway through the stuff I wanted to talk about, and I think there's a lot of other threads here that I would love to pull on. So I will be in touch about that. There is one question I've been asking everyone who's been on these conversations as a bit of a, you know, reminder not to take ourselves too seriously. Sure. Question is, you know, if you're on death row, what would be your last meal?
My last meal on death row. I have an autoimmune disease, so I can't eat a ton of food. So I'm actually like, what would I have? Because it wouldn't matter.
Yeah, quality and quantity, right?
Yeah, I really, man. There's a couple things. My mom's side is from Denmark, and I've been to some of the smaller Danish towns on Jutland, and I had some pretty incredible like roast beef sandwiches, like kind of like open face, smørrebrød on an open face sandwich and stuff. And I had like some of the most, I don't really drink alcohol either, but like I had like these really dark, rich beers there that were just like absolutely amazing, with like dill on the bread, on the meat.
Yeah.
I love that. I'd have like a huge bowl of hot ramen, just like from like some small town in Hokkaido or something. And like I like winter food. I I like heavy food. Like I'll like maybe like a huge glass of like whole milk or something too.
Right. Yeah.
That would be my probably my ideal meal on death row.
Yeah. Yeah. I like how the two meals had a sort of aesthetic element. Like imagine you on the Danish fjord, or
Yeah.
the wonderful landscapes of Hokkaido. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's really good. It's good to know that you're part Danish as well. My 23andMe tells me that that's my second largest component next to the Anglo stuff. So
Yeah, I can tell. Yeah, you got some Danish look to you.
right, yeah, incredibly handsome, right?
Exactly. Incredibly handsome. Some of the best looking people.